Welcome to the first video on the second part of the Phaedo. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Greek conception of the soul. So the soul, that's the topic of our dialogue, of course. And I mean, this sort of comes out as Cooper notes in the introduction to the dialogue. So in ancient times, this dialogue was also known as on the soul, right? So in ancient times, the topic of the soul was really front and center. And in Greek, and soul in Greek, I mean, so talking about this word soul, what it translates, in Greek, there was suke, and that gets translated into Latin as spiritus. But there's also this other Greek word that's closely related, the Greek term pneuma, which meant the breath of life. And this word pneuma comes down to us in words like pneumonia, a disease of the breath, or pneumatic, like a pneumatic tube, a tube that transports documents with air. These words, suke and pneuma, or spiritus, were used for two different conceptions of the soul, both of which are going to be important in our dialogue. So the first is as a life principle, as that which keeps us alive. And so here you can think of, the thing that animates the animal, right? So the thing that makes an animal or a plant not merely dead matter, right? Not merely things that are pushing and pulling one another, but that makes it into a being that can strive to preserve its own existence, right? So the thing that separates living things from non-living things, you might think of this as the breath of life conception, right? So it's that which in our matter makes us alive, that which keeps us alive. So that's going to be one conception of the soul that's important. And then there's a second conception of the soul that's also going to be important, a mental conception. So something like our true selves, or our mind, the thing that makes us who we are, that makes me and not you, right? In the Republic, Plato seems to just have the mental conception of the soul in mind. But here in the Phaedo, when he speaks of the soul, he's drawing both on 1 and 2. Now, our contemporary conception of the soul tends to build in more than just the soul as life principle, that which keeps us alive, or the soul as our mind or our mentality, ourself. Rather, now we tend to think of the soul as also something immortal, right? So there's a third modern conception of the soul, which is an immortal being. But that wasn't built into the Greek conception of the soul. I mean, that wasn't there in ancient Greece. So that's not one of the two that we're going to be most concerned with. But you can see how maybe under the influence of arguments like the argument of the Phaedo, which is arguing for the immortality of the soul, this might have come to be a more prominent conception of the soul as the immortal being. And it's this third conception of the soul as our immortal being, our immortal essence, that can lead us to the question of whether or not we even have a soul, right? So for the ancients, it's a given that we have a soul. I mean, it's almost definitional, right? The soul is whatever gives us life. And so we've got to have a soul, or the soul is our mind. And since we clearly have minds, we have to have a soul. And so for the ancients, there really is no question of whether souls exist, whether there is a soul. That only can become a question once this third dimension of souls enters into the picture, this immortal nature of the soul. And the Greeks aren't nearly as concerned with the third notion and the issues surrounding it that we are, obviously, because it's not built into their conception of the soul. Nonetheless, the immortality of the soul is going to be important for our topic, right? Because even though it's a given that there is a soul, both as life principle and as mental conception, two questions are going to remain that we're going to be tackling in the dialogue. And these come out at 70A to B. So they're talking about whether the soul sticks around after it dies, right? And I think it's Simmias is saying, well, most people think the soul doesn't stick around, right? The soul just disperses like a wind. And the thought you can see is, well, if the soul is a life principle, if it's the thing that keeps the body animated, if it's the anima that animates the body, right? So another Latin term for soul is going to be anima or animus, both of those. If the soul is what animates the body, if it's what keeps it alive, then if the body dies, well, then the soul is going to disappear. The soul is going to evaporate. There's no reason that the soul would stick around because it's what animates the animal. And so the soul just definitionally doesn't seem to exist in a way, right? But here, Plato is going to be arguing it does survive death, right? But that's going to take quite a bit of argument. His companions aren't going to be convinced very easily because they've got this older conception of the soul as a life principle. And then there's this further question: does the soul still, as Cabes puts it, it's Cabes who's talking throughout this whole time. As Cabes puts it, does the soul have some capacity and intelligence after death, right? So is it a self? I mean, is it me that survives death? Right? So is it me? Is it my mind? So on a more ancient conception of the soul, one that's still common in Plato's day, the soul does in a way survive death. It goes down to Hades, but what you find in Hades, and this is really true in the Homeric period. So this is sort of the Homeric conception of the soul. The soul survives, but merely as a sort of abstraction from the living soul, merely as this kind of empty shell, a kind of shadow of the living shell. And in particular, it doesn't survive as a mind, right? So it does not survive in the mental conception. If you went down to Hades, as some do in the Iliad and the Odyssey, the shades that you would meet there, the souls that you would meet there, would be no more than animals. They would have lost their intellect, right? So there's no intellect that survives on the Homeric conception. And so Plato, in arguing that our soul does survive death, is going to end up arguing furthermore that it survives death and survives death as a mind, as an intelligence. Right, so there are going to be two things that need to be shown in the dialogue. First, that the soul survives death, and second, that it doesn't merely survive death in this Homeric way, where it's just this mere shadowy being, this mere almost animal mind, right? It's not an intelligence, but rather it survives death with some capability and intelligence, right? So we want to see that the soul survives death as an intelligence. That's what we're going to be trying, that's what Plato's going to be trying to prove in the Phaedo.